The first real chill of autumn had settled over the hills the night before, just enough to silver the grass with frost and send a whisper through the canopy of old fir trees that lined the edge of Daniel Granger's property. Morning sunlight poured across the fields like spilled gold, and every breath carried the scent of decaying leaves, distant pine, and the deep, earthy perfume of damp moss. Daniel stepped off his porch slowly, coffee in hand, the mug chipped from years of use. Behind him, the old screen door creaked shut with a familiarity that didn't ask for fixing. Life out here was a rhythm, one that asked for quiet participation, not control. And for a man like Daniel, that was all he had left. The land had once felt full of voices, laughter, muddy boots by the door, and warm bread cooling on the counter. But since Marla had passed the previous winter, taken by a sickness that came like a storm and left no time for long goodbyes, everything had thinned, even the silence, except for Max. The German Shepherd had been theirs since he was a pup, nearly 10 now, his muzzle graying, hips a little stiff, but his eyes, those amber eyes, still sharp and searching. He followed Daniel down the back trail without needing a call. They knew the path by heart. It cut behind the cabin, through tall grass and into the woods, where the forest floor turned soft and pine needles muted every step. There were no plans that day, just the quiet companionship of an old dog and a man who had learned to find comfort in trees. Birdsong threaded through the air, warblers mostly, and the occasional flicker tapping on bark. A distant woodpecker knocked out a rhythm like an old clock. The forest wasn't silent, but it moved around Daniel gently, like it understood his sorrow and made room for it. Max trotted ahead, nose low, pausing now and then to sniff the base of a tree or glance over his shoulder. There was something in his pace today, slightly more alert, ears tipped higher, tail still but not relaxed. Daniel noticed. He always did. After Marla passed, it was Max who seemed to understand best. The dog had slept at her bedside until the very end, and afterward refused to leave the room for days. Daniel sometimes wondered if Max still searched for her in the corners of the woods. They reached the clearing near the stream, a place Daniel often sat. A broad, flat rock jutted from the earth near the bank, and he climbed onto it now, mug warming his palms. Max stood nearby, motionless, and then they both heard it. A sound so small, so out of place, it stopped the moment. A meow. At first Daniel thought he imagined it, a trick of the wind through branches perhaps. But then it came again, thin and sharp, like a violin string pulled too tight. Meow. Not the soft cry of a barn cat looking for food. No, this was different. There was something wild in it. Something broken. Max turned sharply toward the source, ears forward, his body lowered into a stance Daniel hadn't seen in years. Not aggression, curiosity laced with instinct. The dog took 2 steps forward, then paused. Daniel set his mug down and stood slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans. The sound came again, and this time it was closer. From just beyond a fallen log, partly covered in moss and mushrooms. Cautiously Daniel stepped forward, heart beginning to stir. Not in fear, but in that way a person feels when the world shifts ever so slightly beneath their feet. He peered over the log. There, curled in a shallow nest of pine needles, was a kitten, no larger than a man's glove, thin, its ribs faintly visible through its tawny fur. But even in its fragility, it held a presence that didn't belong to any ordinary cat. The markings were wrong. Spots mottled its flanks. The ears were tufted with little black wisps. The tail was short, not bobbed, but naturally stunted, as if evolution had trimmed it to purpose. And those eyes, large, luminous, set wide apart and filled with something Daniel recognized not as fear, but calculation. The kitten meowed again, and Daniel felt it like a shiver across his spine. It wasn't just the sound that was off, it was the feeling behind it. There was something uncivilized there, some echo of the deep woods that no tame creature carried. Max took a step closer, then stopped as the kitten fixed its eyes on him. The moment hung like breath in the cold. Then, against every natural instinct Daniel expected from both animals, the kitten didn't flee. She didn't hiss or run. She simply sat, ears perked, and waited. Daniel crouched, lowering himself beside Max. "Easy, boy," he murmured, placing a steadying hand on the shepherd's back. Max didn't move, didn't growl. He was locked on her, watchful but not hostile. As though he understood something, even Daniel did not. Daniel reached a hand forward, slowly, letting it hover just above the pine needles. "Where's your mama, little one?" he whispered. She didn't blink, only tilted her head slightly, and for the briefest of moments, Daniel saw it. Not just her youth or her wildness, but something else. Loneliness. He stayed like that for a while, crouched beside Max, unsure whether he was comforting the kitten or himself. The forest carried on around them, wind stirring high above, birds flitting between branches, life going about its endless turning. But at that log, in that clearing, three souls sat in pause. And Daniel knew, in the deep unspoken place where grief and instinct meet, that he wouldn't walk away. Not from her. Not this time. Daniel didn't carry her at first. He sat there for a long time, letting the silence between them settle into something familiar. Max had lain down in the moss, eyes flicking between the kitten and the woods beyond. It was as if all three of them had entered some ancient agreement, to share space without demand, without fear. But as the sun tilted west and the breeze sharpened, Daniel finally rose. "All right then," he murmured. "Let's not make this harder than it already is." He took off his flannel overshirt, folded it into a cradle, and gently reached down. The kitten didn't resist. Her tiny body was surprisingly light, almost too light, her bones delicate under his fingers. Up close he could see just how wrong she was for this place. No collar, no signs of human care. And yet, she was still breathing, still fighting. Her eyes stayed fixed on his face all the way back to the cabin. The walk was quiet, and Max trotted a few paces behind, less like a guardian and more like a witness. By the time they reached the back porch, the light was leaning into amber, and a thin mist had begun rising from the meadow beyond the creek. Inside, the cabin was still and worn, the kind of place built to be lived in, not looked at. A cast-iron stove sat dormant in the corner, and the old armchair still bore the shape of Marla's reading habit. Daniel laid the kitten on a folded towel near the hearth and lit the fire with careful hands, not rushing. He worked like a man used to handling fragile things. Max curled nearby, keeping one eye open. Daniel poured warm goat milk into a shallow saucer and dipped his finger in to touch the kitten's mouth. She licked instinctively, but without urgency. He tried not to think about how long she'd gone without food. After a while, she began to drink on her own, slowly, her whiskers twitching. That same ragged little meow came again, softer this time. Daniel leaned back and just watched her. "You're not meant for this place," he said quietly. "And neither was I, once." He didn't name her yet. Names had weight, and he wasn't ready to carry that kind of hope. Not after Marla. Not after the days that had bled into nights with nothing but Max and memory for company. But as the fire crackled and the shadows grew long, the little stranger tucked herself into the folds of the towel and closed her eyes. Daniel sat in silence, listening to the quiet rhythm of her breath and the steady ticking of the old mantel clock. He didn't know what she was, not yet, but he knew what she wasn't. She wasn't ready to be alone, and neither, perhaps, was he. Daniel had always believed in listening, really listening to the world around him, not just to the spoken words of people, which so often betrayed them, but to the quiet languages that filled the spaces in between. The groan of wind through rafters, the way a dog shifts before a storm, the silence of a forest that senses a stranger. That afternoon, crouched beside Max and Whistle at the window, he heard a silence he recognized. It was the silence of longing. Whistle's gaze remained fixed on the trees, not in fear, but in the raw, magnetic way wild things look at home. Her muscles were tight, but not tense. She was remembering something, perhaps. A scent, a sound. Or maybe it wasn't memory at all. Maybe it was instinct, louder than thought, reaching into her from some ancient root buried in her blood. Max, always steady, gave a low exhale and lay down beside her. His body made a soft thud against the wood floor. But his eyes remained open, watching Daniel as if he too had accepted what the man had only just begun to admit. Whistle wasn't here to stay, and that, more than anything, was what ached. Daniel stood slowly, ran a hand through his beard, and walked to the back door. The sky was soft gray now, full of the smell of distant rain. He stepped outside onto the porch, leaving the door ajar behind him. The air carried a damp coolness, the kind that pulled at your collar and settled in your bones. A flicker of movement drew his eye to the pine edge beyond the yard. A rabbit, startled, darted into the underbrush. Just another reminder of how wildness never truly left this place. It just watched, waited, and sometimes, briefly, stepped forward in the form of a tufted-eared kitten. By the time he returned inside, Whistle had moved from the window. She was now curled on the rug, tail wrapped around her body, though her ears still ticked with every creak of wood or whisper of wind. Daniel poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the kitchen table. It was time to start thinking clearly. He opened his old laptop, dusty but reliable, and typed in the questions he'd been trying to avoid. How to rewild a bobcat kitten, what to feed before release, signs of readiness. The articles were inconsistent, cautious. Some said it was impossible. Others offered stories of miraculous success. But all agreed on one thing: wild instincts remain, even when buried under care and comfort. If the animal is still wild inside, it will show you. And Daniel had seen it. In her eyes, in the twitch of her haunches, in that moment at the window where the forest wasn't a stranger to her, but a whispering home calling her name. Over the next week, Daniel began a slow, bittersweet dance. He moved her feeding bowls closer to the door, then, eventually just outside. He left a crate out back with a fleece blanket for warmth, letting her come and go. He brought home feathers and bones from the woods, encouraging her hunting instincts with play. Some days, she would chase them with wild delight. Others, she ignored them, choosing instead to climb onto Max's back and nap between his shoulder blades. Max never complained. The bond between dog and kitten was something Daniel couldn't explain. Max had never been particularly gentle, not aggressive, but not tender either. But with Whistle, he seemed to know exactly how fragile and how fierce she was. He let her bat his ears with sharp little claws. He shared his water bowl. He even tolerated her sleeping in his bed, curled up like a comma against his ribs. Daniel found himself watching them more than he should, capturing mental photographs he knew he would one day need to remember this time, this odd family of three. One evening, a light rain tapped the roof as Daniel sat in his armchair, the fire crackling low. Whistle was perched on the back of the chair now, just above his shoulder. She often did that, perched rather than rested, as if gravity didn't apply to her the same way. He was reading, or trying to, when she leaned forward and pressed her nose to his temple. A tiny touch. Then she leapt off and vanished into the shadows near the back door. Max raised his head, ears alert. Daniel stood quickly, heart snagging in his chest. The door was open. It hadn't latched. He stepped outside, barefoot, heart thudding in time with the rain. "Whistle," he called softly. "Whistle, girl." No answer. Only the sound of trees breathing and the rhythmic drip of water from the porch gutter. He and Max searched the perimeter with flashlights. Under the porch, behind the woodpile, down to the edge of the creek, her paw prints dotted the soft mud like punctuation, leading nowhere and everywhere. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He lay awake in the living room, boots on, listening for every rustle, every creak, every cry. But the only sounds were wind and memory. By morning, he had come to terms with it. Whistle had gone back to the forest. Not because she didn't love them in whatever way wild creatures do, but because love. Them in whatever way wild creatures do, but because love wasn't enough to hold her here. She was still out there, maybe not far, watching, testing, becoming what she was always meant to be. Max paced that day, softly, quietly, but by evening, he settled. He too had understood. Daniel sat by the window at dusk, staring into the pines. A part of him felt empty again, but it was different now. Not the emptiness of loss, the emptiness of letting go. And that was something he hadn't done since Marla. The cabin felt different without her, not quieter. Whistle had never made much noise, aside from that haunting little mule, but less alive, less unpredictable. Daniel noticed the difference in the smallest ways. How the mornings no longer began with the frantic sound of paws scrambling across the kitchen floor. How Max no longer stirred in the middle of the night to accommodate the feather-light weight of a kitten curled into his ribs. It was the kind of absence that was loud in its own way. Not a hole exactly. More like a shadow. Daniel told himself he'd done the right thing. Letting her go wasn't just kindness, it was necessity. Wild things couldn't be held, not without cost, and he had seen the signs. Her eyes had turned to the trees long before her paws had, but that didn't stop him from glancing toward the edge of the forest every morning, just in case. Max seemed to share the same quiet longing. The shepherd would patrol the edge of the yard, nose low to the ground, tail still, not searching exactly, but waiting. The way a soldier waits after the ceasefire, unsure if peace is permanent. A week passed, then 10 days. On the 12th evening, Daniel was stacking kindling by the shed when Max froze near the gate. His ears perked, body taut like a drawn bow. Daniel followed his gaze, heart quickening. At first he saw nothing, just trees and dusk and the wavering curtain of fog rolling down the hill. But then, a shape, low and lean, slinking between the trees. Silent, cautious, whistle. Daniel didn't call out. He barely breathed. She emerged slowly, paw by paw, like a ghost hesitating between worlds. Her eyes caught the porch light, and in them, Daniel saw something he hadn't before. Distance. She wasn't the same. Her coat was darker, fuller now. Her movements had shifted, more fluid, more calculating. No longer a kitten chasing sunbeams on hardwood floors. She had learned things out there, things no human could teach. Still, she came closer. Max held his position but didn't bark. Instead, he walked a few paces forward and stopped. They looked at each other, dog and bobcat. Two souls from different languages, somehow fluent in the same story. Then she stepped forward. It wasn't a reunion, not in the way people think of them. There were no leaps of joy, no cries, no clinging, just presence. Whistle sat at the edge of the porch, blinking slowly at Daniel, her body relaxed, tail twitching with soft deliberation. Max walked to her side and sat too, like they'd done this before, many times, in 100 dreams Daniel never saw. He stepped forward and crouched slowly. "You came back," he whispered. She didn't move toward him, but she didn't run either. And for a moment, that was enough. Her eyes, wide and yellow, held something he couldn't name. Trust, maybe, or memory, or just a brief yielding of her wildness, a nod to the life they had shared. Daniel didn't reach for her. He only watched. After a few minutes, she stood, turned, and padded back toward the trees. But halfway down the slope, she stopped, looked back, then disappeared into the shadows. That became the rhythm. She didn't come every day. Sometimes a week would pass, sometimes more. But then, just as the emptiness began to settle in again, she would appear. By the gate, in the high grass near the woodpile, or even curled quietly in Max's bed, as if she'd never left. Daniel stopped trying to track her. He learned to accept that she existed on her own terms now. But each time she returned, it etched something into him. A healing, slow and uneven, like moss reclaiming stone. One night in early fall, with frost beginning to bite the grass, Daniel left the back door open for her. He lit a fire and sat down with a mug of tea. Max lay by the hearth, half asleep, tail flicking. Whistle came just after midnight. She didn't make a sound, just slipped through the doorway like a shadow and walked to the rug. She didn't climb onto his lap, didn't purr. She simply lay down, curled tight, and closed her eyes. And Daniel cried, not loud, not shaking. Just the kind of tears that happen when something inside finally exhales. Grief and gratitude, tangled together like vines, rising up after too long underground. He didn't reach for her, but he whispered, "You're always welcome here." In the weeks that followed, she stayed longer, sometimes a whole night, sometimes two. She brought with her the scent of pine and soil, her coat dusted with the secrets of the forest. She never slept through the night, but she stayed. By winter, Daniel had built a small lean-to near the shed, outfitted with straw and a heat lamp on a timer. He told himself it was for any wild creature that might need it, but they both knew who it was for. Whistle remained wild. She hunted. She roamed. But when the snows came heavy and the wind howled against the windows, she came home. Home, not because she had to, because she chose to. The first heavy snow came in early January. It blanketed the cabin in a hush so complete, even Max's usual patrols were shorter, his tracks shallow in the powder. Daniel stood at the kitchen window with a mug in his hands, watching the pine boughs sag under the weight. Everything looked still, but he knew better. Stillness wasn't silence. It was patience. That night, just after midnight, he heard it. The softest scrape of claws on the back porch, followed by a low chuff. Max lifted his head from the hearthrug, tail thudding once, not in alarm, but in greeting. Daniel opened the door. Whistle stood just beyond the threshold, her coat rimmed with frost. Her eyes met his briefly. Acknowledgement, not asking. She walked past him, fluid as fog, and made her way straight to the warm corner by the fire. Max didn't move. He just adjusted slightly, giving her space without fuss. Daniel sat in his armchair and watched them. There was no need to speak. In that quiet room, filled with the crackle of fire and the gentle breathing of furred friends, everything had already been said. She didn't stay forever. Whistle never would. That wasn't her nature. Come spring, her visits became rarer, her absences longer. One evening, she arrived with a scratch across her cheek and the confident air of something that had won a fight. She was growing into the wilderness, becoming something sharper, stronger. Daniel understood. Some stories don't end where you want them to, but they don't vanish either. Sometimes they circle back, like shadows at dusk. Sometimes they linger in the way you leave the door ajar, or in the paw prints you refuse to sweep off the porch. Years passed. Max grew slower, his face whitening with age. Daniel, too, his beard going grayer, his knees stiffer. But every winter, when the first hard frost settled and the wind carried the hush of pine needles over snow, he left the lean-to ready, a blanket, some straw, and a bowl of fresh water. Not because he expected her, but because some part of him always hoped, and some hopes are worth holding, even if they never return. Sometimes he'd wake to find paw prints around the shed. Once, a feather left on the porch, clues, hints, like she was reminding him, I was here. I remember. One February morning, he found Max staring out the window, ears forward, tail wagging softly. By the time Daniel got there, all he saw was the trees. But that was enough. Because some creatures are never ours to keep, but they stay with us, in the quietest places, where instinct meets memory and wild hearts never forget.